Well, welcome back to Old Testament Survey, everybody. We've already talked about poetry and the poetry of the book of Psalms. In this video, we want to introduce wisdom literature and specifically talk about that first wisdom book, go a little bit deeper into the book of Proverbs. Now, technically, the wisdom literature really is only these first three books, Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. They reflect the sort of the wisdom literature of Israel in the ancient Near East. Song of Solomon gets thrown into the wisdom literature because of its association with Solomon, traditionally the author of the book. But in this video, I just want to briefly introduce wisdom literature and then talk about the book of Proverbs. So there are these three books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, and they represent Israelite wisdom literature. And so they address, all three of these books address the question, what kind of world do we live in? What does it look like to live well? How do we be good at life? And each of these three books takes a little bit different perspective on those questions, but how to live life before God and live it well and wisely. Now, if we were to think of these three books, maybe a good way to think of them is that, the book of Proverbs, or the author there, is this brilliant young teacher. And really, it's personified as a woman who's this teacher. She's brilliant. She knows a lot about the world that God has made, and she's offering this knowledge and intelligence to young students so that they can learn how the world that God made is structured, and so that they can live well in that world, morally and ethically, doing what is wise. Ecclesiastes, the author there, might be thought of as a sharp, middle-aged critic, a bit of a philosopher, someone who always sees the other side of things, the other side of the issue. Sometimes people will state a position, and then there's on the other hand. Well, Ecclesiastes is that person who thinks about that on the other hand perspective. And then there's the book of Job, who might be thought of as a weathered old man. This person has lived a fair amount of life, has experienced a lot in this life, particularly in terms of pain and suffering, and then ponders the question, how do we live well before God in the midst of suffering and pain? Well, let me quickly introduce you to the two types of wisdom literature that we find in the Bible, in the Old Testament. First of all, there's proverbial wisdom, or sometimes it's referred to as simple wisdom. Well, what are the characteristics of proverbial wisdom? Well, you can see them here. First of all, proverbial wisdom is didactic. Now, that's a word that just means teaching. So the nature of this material is that it's teaching, that it's instruction from a father to a son on how to live a successful life. This, of course, is represented by the book of Proverbs. And if you read Proverbs, it's very instructional. It kind of functions as a curriculum of education within the family and perhaps more formally in schools, teaching young people how to live morally and wisely. Very often the father's lessons will begin, listen to my words. Listen to this instruction. And so the student is supposed to listen and submit and learn. So the book of Proverbs, proverbial simple wisdom, is didactic. Secondly, it's optimistic about life. In other words, if you follow this teaching, if you do what it says, life will go well for you. You can be successful, you can be happy, you can be fulfilled, if you kind of conform your life to the curriculum and the teaching that you find in the book of Proverbs. And then thirdly, proverbial simple wisdom in the book of Proverbs involves the doctrine of retribution. That is, there's a cause and effect relationship that's involved here. If the student obeys and does what he's supposed to do, there's success. and fulfillment and happiness. On the other hand, if the student doesn't do it and instead engages in sin and disobedience, there's going to be punishment. And so there's a cause and effect. There's a nexus between obedience and success and sin and punishment. Now, a second type of biblical wisdom literature is contemplative wisdom, or sometimes called complex wisdom. This type of wisdom is represented by the books of Ecclesiastes and Job. Proverbs says, obey and it will go well with you. Ecclesiastes and Job come along and say, yeah, well, we tried that and it didn't go so well for us. So this is kind of the other side of the coin of biblical wisdom. It's contemplative, it's complex. It involves long essays where the authors will write long reflections, maybe philosophical reflections on the meaning of life. And you see that in Ecclesiastes and Job. Secondly, it's pessimistic. Proverbs says, obey and it will go well with you. Job and Ecclesiastes say, well, it didn't for us, not for me. And so it's sort of negative and pessimistic about sort of obeying the rules and being obedient. Does that always work out? Does that always equal success? Well, Job and Ecclesiastes say no, it doesn't always equal success. But nevertheless, that doesn't make God wrong. We can still have faith and live well before God, even in those circumstances when it doesn't work out. And then thirdly, there's no cause and effect relationship between obedience and success and sin and punishment. Life doesn't always go that way. And yet, say Job and Ecclesiastes, we can still have faith in God. So what about this book of Proverbs more specifically? Well, you found out in the Bible Project video about the author and as Solomon, some of the other authors that are mentioned in the book. This book of Proverbs is an anthology. That is, it's a collection of short sayings, probably a collection of sayings that are very old, that don't even originate with in Israel. In other words, some of these sayings are known to have been drawn from Egypt or Mesopotamia, where they were used there and then put into the book of Proverbs. Secondly, the book of Proverbs is very practical. It clarifies right and wrong conduct in a whole host of situations and circumstances. And then we need to remember that these are proverbs and not promises. They're general observations about life. Here you can see two consecutive verses in Proverbs 26. One of them says, do not answer a fool according to his folly. The very next verse says, answer a fool according to his folly. Well, which is it? Well, the answer is, well, it depends on the fool, and it depends what they said. So these aren't sort of black and white rules and promises. They're general observations about how life goes, and we need to reflect on the Proverbs and then apply them to our own personal circumstances. Let me just give you an example of some of the things that we find in Proverbs. Some of the Proverbs are very colorful. A quarrelsome person starts fights as easily as a match sets fire to paper. Well, that's pretty graphic, and it's pretty colorful and easy to understand. Here's one that involves attitude for life. When a man is gloomy, everything seems to go wrong. When he is cheerful, everything seems right. Isn't that so? Just kind of a basic attitude toward life. Here's a humorous one. If a man loudly blesses his neighbor in the morning, it will be taken as a curse. There are two kinds of people. There are morning people, and there are those people who hate morning people. Well, maybe if you're that morning person, then maybe what you say and what you do might not necessarily be received so well, and you kind of have to apply it again to your own particular circumstance. Here's a graphic one. He who keeps malice harbors a viper in his heart. Now, that image is very, it's sort of very graphic and visual. And then the one that we saw before, like a gold ring and a pig's snout, is a beautiful woman who shows no discretion. Well, here you see the first 7 verses of the book of Proverbs, and these verses state very well the purpose of this book. It's for attaining wisdom and discipline. Now, wisdom is a word that doesn't primarily or only mean mental ability. It doesn't only just refer to the mind and the intellect. Wisdom is a word that refers to morality and ethics and obedience and obeying God and becoming disciplined in that kind of life for doing what is right and just and fair. So you see, the purpose of the book of Proverbs is to learn to live a moral life that is ethical and right and just and conforms to God's definition of good. Who can benefit from this book, this education in morality? Well, simple people, young people, that is, those who are just beginning to learn. But also, this book is beneficial for the wise. Those who have lived life a little bit longer can still learn and benefit and grow in living a life of morality and obedience. So the purpose of this book is that it's a curriculum of education to learn and grow into living God's kind of good life, morally and obediently. Remember, that's what the humans rejected back in the Garden of Eden. They wanted to make their own definition of good and evil. And then ever since that moment of the fall into sin, human beings have been sort of tempted to define good and evil for themselves. Even the Israelites did that, as we found out in their history. So this is a book that teaches human beings and us to conform our lives to God's definition of good. And one of the other things that we should point out about that word wisdom is that it refers to a divine world moral order that God has sort of built into the structure of the universe. There's a morality, there's an order that's just built into life. And the task of human beings, says the book of Proverbs, is to conform our lives to that moral order that we observe in the world. Now, it's interesting that almost every culture throughout history has observed this moral order in the world. In the Far East, they call it Tao. In Egypt, they call it Ma'at. In Greek, they call it Logos. In Hebrew, in the Old Testament, they call it Chokmah. That's the Hebrew word for wisdom. That is, Chokmah, or wisdom, means that there's a moral order in the world, and God put it there. And we as human beings can best live life if we conform ourselves to that order. Interesting, there's really only one culture that doesn't really agree with sort of any order or moral order in the world. And that's our culture. Western culture says, well, you know, there are laws of gravity, there are physical laws, but there are no spiritual, moral laws. We can kind of just do whatever we want. And so that's why this book of Proverbs is so important, because it reminds us that there is a moral order, and life is best lived if we conform ourselves to it. In marriage, in family, in sexuality, with money, finances, anger, words, work, all of it has a moral order that we need to learn. Another thing that we can point out about Proverbs and this educational system is that this phrase, fear of the Lord, is very important in this learning process. You can see it occurs here several times in Proverbs. This is only a sampling. There are many more. But the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It's the beginning of wisdom. It's the starting point in this curriculum of education. And so this is a statement on epistemology. Epistemology is just a philosophical word for the study of knowledge. And how do we know what we know? Well, the book of Proverbs says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. In other words, a respect for God, a submission to God, a sort of a healthy fear of punishment from God is the beginning point in the learning process. Just like for a young child, as they learn to obey, one of the important things is the fear of punishment from a parent or an authority figure, and in that way they learn to do the right thing. I wrote a whole dissertation on the fear of the Lord. I won't give it to you in this video, but the fear of the Lord kind of has two aspects to it. It functions at the beginning of the education process as kind of that healthy fear of punishment and submission to God. But then here we find in Proverbs 2 that fear of the Lord is also the goal, the end point of the education process. If we accept the Father's words, and if we call out for insight, and if we look for wisdom and education as for silver, then the result is we will understand the fear of the Lord. Now, in this second sense of the fear of the Lord, I think that the fear of the Lord is sort of the equivalent of a moral conscience. At the beginning of the education, fear of the Lord is fear of punishment. But here, the second aspect, at the end of that education process, a person has developed a moral conscience. That is, we can do the right thing without having anybody stand over us threatening punishment. We just have that internal sense of morality and obedience as a mature person. So fear of the Lord is very important. It functions at the beginning kind of as a healthy threat of punishment as we learn to obey and practice these lessons, but it also is something that we can think of at the end of the process where we have developed a mature moral conscience. So here's my definition of wisdom. Wisdom means knowing the right thing, doing the right thing, knowing why you're doing what is right, that is to please God, and then here, this is important, wanting to do it, developing a desire, a moral conscience to just want to do the right thing. So wisdom and fear of the Lord are very important in learning to live that good life before God. Some of you might be familiar with Kohlberg's stages of moral development. You know, the first stage is just avoiding punishment. That's why we do what is right. You know, the ultimate stage is a principled moral conscience. And in my dissertation, I suggested that the fear of the Lord plays an important role at the beginning as a threat of punishment, and also at the end as it refers to this developed moral conscience, a reasoned moral conscience. So wisdom refers to the divine order of morality in the world, and the fear of the Lord is an important aspect of developing and learning to conform ourselves to that order. Here's just a quick quote from my dissertation. Moral character is the greatest goal of education and the greatest challenge, because moral character comes down to desiring the right things. And the question is, how can we teach desire? How can we teach that a person to desire and want to do the right thing? I think the fear of the Lord is a very important part of that aspect of desire. And finally, just quickly, what are some of the connections of this book of Proverbs to Jesus? Well, it turns out if you read the New Testament, many of the authors describe Jesus in wisdom terms. Here's one place in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Jesus Christ has become for us wisdom. In other words, Jesus is the perfect model and example of what it means to be morally obedient, conforming to the order that God has put into the world. And so as we follow Jesus, we're learning to live God's kind of life morally and obediently. Here's Matthew 12. Says that now that Jesus has come, one greater than Solomon is here. Solomon is the person associated with the wisdom movement in Israel, and now Jesus has come along as one who is even wiser as a teacher, as a moral teacher. Colossians 2, Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And so Jesus, again, is described as the ultimate person of wisdom. And then finally, here's John chapter 1. This is wisdom language. In the beginning was the Word. The Greek word for translated word here is the Greek word logos. That's the Greek word for moral order and the intelligence of God. And here at the beginning of the Gospel of John, the author is describing Jesus in that way. Jesus is the moral order and intelligence of God, and in him is real life. So that's the book of Proverbs. It's a book of education in learning to become a moral, obedient person living according to God's definition of the good life.